Hello, everyone. So I'm Vandana Janeja, and I am with Catalyst. And today, as you've heard just now, there are so many different avenues through which we can work towards creating greater gender equality in the workplace, and particularly in the mining sector. And what we'll be talking about today is really engaging men in gender initiatives. So I'll share a little bit about our Catalyst research on engaging men, which has been taking place over the course of several years now, as well as a practical example and some information and resources around our MARC community, which stands for Men Advocating Real Change. So I hope that this discussion today will help you to foster some ideas on how you might be able to encourage an inclusive work environment in your organization, as well as how we can create greater gender equality within the sector overall. As you've just heard, Catalyst is a global nonprofit. We've been around since the early 60s, so Catalyst has been doing this work for over 55 years now. It's the leading nonprofit organization working globally to accelerate progress for women through workplace inclusion. So we actually work with over 800 supporting companies worldwide. Our supporters include large Fortune 500, FP 500 companies, as well as law firms, for example, consulting firms, as well as some universities, nonprofits, and government agencies as well. And I'll just share that we are a global organization. We are operating, we have a presence in Canada, the US, Europe, India, Australia, and Japan. And I mentioned that global nature of our organization so you can have a sense of some of the organizations that we actually work with on the ground. We have the benefit of connecting with them, learning about how inclusion is taking shape and progressing in different parts of the globe, and bringing that knowledge back to our supporters in various locations. So today we're talking about engaging men, as I mentioned. So why talk about men? Why is this critical? Well, the engagement of men in diversity in the workplace is important for a number of reasons. For example, Catalyst has done research tracking the career advancement of high potential graduates around the world from major universities. Essentially, we looked at the success patterns of the cream of the crop. And in our research, we found that there are persistent gender gaps in promotion rates. The only thing that closed that gap was when women had highly placed male mentors, or sponsors, really. They were very critical to career acceleration. Men are also getting highly placed male mentors or sponsors, often very early in their careers, and generally in their first job right out of school. So this idea of cross-gender and mentoring or sponsoring relationships is quite important for women. We know that men have a critical role to play in creating more inclusive workplaces, but we've learned that men don't always feel that there's a space for them to safely engage with each other and with women in tackling the issue of gender gaps in the workplace. So very often, and with good intentions, organizations tend to focus solely on women's experience in the workplace. And a result of that is that the gender gap is seen as just a women's issue addressed by women. So we oftentimes will see conversations taking place that are groups of women talking to women about women for the benefit of women. And Catalyst has been working to change this over the years. And today, as I mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about this in terms of our engaging men research. So we'll explore cultural forces that can undermine efforts to engage men. So what's holding men back? We'll also look at some insights about why some men support others and why some resist gender initiatives. And finally, we'll look at recommendations of where to take things from here, including some actions that you can actually take to champion inclusion in your organization. In our research series on engaging men, we started out with this work back in 2009, and we identified hurdles to men's advocacy for gender initiatives, as well as ways to remove some of these hurdles. So we conducted in-depth interviews with men who were already championing gender equality to identify some critical experiences. Hypotheses were then developed and then tested by surveying a large group of men. And respondents came from global corporations, as I mentioned, our global presence, and represented a range of functions as well as industries and geographies around the globe. The sample included men who were identified as champions of gender equality and a similar comparison group or comparator group of men judged as not championing gender equality. Then, based on survey responses, we identified factors that distinguish individuals. First, those who had high awareness of gender bias versus those with low awareness. And second, those who were championing gender equality versus those who were not. So, why are some men not engaged in gender championship? Well, men, key stakeholders in most workplaces, may not all be fully on board with the message of gender equality. And I have to say that I've seen this change to a great extent over the last several years, and we've really built a ton of momentum in this area in terms of conversation and dialogue on gender equality amongst senior male leaders. At the time of this research, initially, less than half of the men thought that gender stereotyping was a barrier to women's advancement, while more than 3/4 of the women disagreed with that. This was based on previous Catalyst research. We found at that time that most companies had not done a good enough job at engaging and educating men with respect to gender equality and inclusion. And as I mentioned, this is of course changing, so we've really seen some momentum in this area. But touching on some of the beliefs about why men weren't engaged at that time, and you may see some of these and recognize them in conversations or thoughts or perspectives that you have had either now or in the past. Some of these beliefs are that men are sexist. Men don't care about equality or equity or about others. Men are the problem with respect to women making progress. Men carry much of the privilege, so they're in a privileged position and they don't really have the incentive to be engaged in the conversation. Or men might lose power, so this idea of zero-sum thinking, where if women are given opportunities to progress and proceed, then men may lose out on their power. Also, the perspective that everything is fine, so there isn't a problem, we're basing our workplaces on meritocracy, and everything's fine. Men have no point of reference, so that this might not be a conversation that they've been engaged in, and they may not feel comfortable in actually being a part of that dialogue. And then finally, this idea that diversity is a topic that has nothing to do with men. We know over the years that many of these perspectives and possible beliefs, or I'd like to call them assumptions, are not necessarily the case. They're just assumptions. And we've seen very much, and particularly on that last point, diversity and inclusion are very much conversations that men and particularly senior male leaders have become very much a part of over the years. And we've recognized that there are benefits to organizations to having the conversation and dialogue around inclusion. But let's take a step back now for a moment to look at some of the barriers to change. So in our research, apathy was mentioned by nearly 75% of participants. Many men were unconcerned about issues of gender, and they didn't see a compelling reason for being involved in the conversation. Now, delving into this theme of apathy further showed that men are often unaware of how they might benefit from participating. This suggests that while many D&I practitioners may feel that the business case conversation is tired, right? We've had this conversation. We know what the business case is around diversity and having greater diversity in our senior leadership and having more inclusive work environments. Some men may remain unfamiliar with the general arguments in this case, and particularly the ones that discuss the ways in which men personally benefit from equality. So, for example, it's not just women that lose out without equality. Men can suffer or bear negative impacts as well. There's the pressure to bear primary financial responsibility in a family and constant competition with others to acquire status. They may experience more distant relationships with spouses or partners and children in terms of their engagement in the workplace and lack of time for family and outside pursuits. And all of which may lead to poor psychological and physical health over time. We've seen this play out in the research, and we can see this sense of apathy can have negative impacts. So our research suggests that men will continue to be unlikely to support gender equity unless they appreciate fully what's at stake and how not only women, but they as well as men can benefit from challenging the status quo. And ultimately, this isn't just about men and women, this is about how organizations can benefit at the end of the day. A second barrier that we see with respect to change is fear. Now, this second theme of fear, this idea was expressed in three ways that we found in our Catalyst research over the years. First of all, support for equality is impacted by fears of losing status and privilege. So this is where this idea of zero-sum thinking or a zero-sum mentality comes in. This is the notion that when one individual succeeds, it lessens the next person's potential. Changing this mindset was found to be critical to gain support of men. So this idea that, if your light is shining brighter than someone else's is going to be more dim, or vice versa. It doesn't have to be this idea of a zero-sum game. The second way in which fear was expressed was the fear of making mistakes, so doing or saying the wrong things. Some men may fear that no matter what their intentions, they'll be seen as being part of the problem rather than the solution. There might be a feeling of, well, whatever I say is going to be the wrong thing, so I'm just not going to say anything. And so holding back or not being part of that conversation and that dialogue as a result of this fear. And third, there was the fear that supporting gender equity would bring the disapproval of other men. So almost this idea of, well, why are you part of that conversation about women's advancement? And this is closely tied with the idea of masculine norms in the workplace, such as acceptance from other men as a measure of masculinity. So in terms of the barriers to change, we've got apathy, we've got fear, which has actually been expressed in very valid ways through our research. And then finally, there's this idea of ignorance, and that's whether it's actually perceived or real. So this is the idea that because I'm a man, I can't participate in gender conversations, or actual ignorance, whereby some individuals may lack the awareness of gender bias and what its potential ramifications are in the workplace. And so what's the result of this? The assumptions that we've seen and the potential barriers, we see several results playing out. First of all, we see men having the experience of feeling blamed, almost like they need to walk on eggshells for fear of saying the wrong thing, as I mentioned previously. And I encourage anyone on the line, men and women, I'd encourage men to think about as we go through this list, are there any of these things that you've felt or you've experienced? Or for women in the group, are there any of these things where, you may have sensed this on the part of your male colleagues or coworkers, or situations where you may have inadvertently and unintentionally brought up these feelings? So next was the sense of authenticity of men being questioned when they do speak up. Almost this belief that someone's handed them sort of a script or a cue card to say, these are the things you need to say, and they're going off and saying them, and that's not really their own perceived belief or perception of things. So men are operating on the sidelines. They're not expected to lead D&I efforts, especially white men. So we often see women or diverse women leading the conversations around diversity and inclusion. We also see what we tend to call diversity fatigue, whether that's for women, for visible minorities, or for individuals in general. Almost a sense of, we've been having this conversation around diversity, and how long are we going to continue to have the conversation as opposed to moving towards action? And men might actually feel a lack of opportunity to be part of this dialogue, to support other men in this dialogue as well. They might also feel that they're the ones who are being told that they need to learn something here, as opposed to we all need to learn something, and we all want to find ways in which to create more inclusive work environments. And then lastly, this idea of zero-sum conversations, where we may perceive and men may feel that there's distinct winners and losers in the conversation, and so it's not one that they really wish to be a part of. So we know there's a number of benefits for organizations in terms of having more diverse and inclusive organizations at large. If you look at the business case, and Catalyst has done a lot of work in this area as well, we see, for example, enhanced financial performance. We see Those organizations that have greater diversity at senior levels, we see greater market reputation, oftentimes expressed through greater CSR ratings. We also see that there is greater employee engagement, greater ability to attract, retain, and engage employees. And finally, there's ultimately greater group creativity, and this is a key one, better team citizenship and greater innovation in organizations. So there's a number of benefits for organizations in terms of having greater diversity and inclusion. Now, for men to be a part of the conversation, this is where we see benefits that men report as well. And these include, and you'll see them here, things like, for example, they have talked about better physical and psychological health, more rewarding and intimate relationships with partners and children. As I mentioned, there's greater opportunity for work-life flexibility and integration and spending time on priorities outside of the workplace. Freedom to parent more substantively. This goes along with having more time outside of the workplace as well, when these conversations are being had about gender equity and the responsibilities of shared parenting or shared responsibilities amongst members of a household. Freedom to be themselves, living according to their own values and not just traditional gender norms. Sharing financial responsibility as well. And this leads to some of that reduced panic about needing to be the sole breadwinner as well. So greater equality in the workplace can actually have really wonderful positive benefits for both men and women, both inside and outside of the workplace. So we talked a bit about some of the barriers that may exist. So what do we do then about removing some of these barriers? Well, when we look at men's awareness of gender bias leading towards action, our research revealed 3 key factors that can really pave the way towards this greater awareness of inequity. The first was defying masculine norms. So in this context, masculine norms are really the rules in society about how a man should behave. You might want to think about this as what we call the man box. So if you're inside the man box, you're doing all of these things that are set out by masculine norms in society in terms of how you should behave. Those could include things like, not expressing emotion, or boys don't cry, or needing to be strong all the time, needing to be more outspoken or competitive or aggressive. These rules are widely communicated and reinforced in our culture. And one of the masculine norms could be, for example, putting priority on work and, if you want to call it, winning in the workplace over family commitments. Many of these masculine norms are very subtle. They vary by geography. And one thing that I think they have in common across many geographies is that they're hard to talk openly about. We don't want to sit down and say, these are the things that I feel I'm being told that I need to do in order to be expressing myself as a man. Those are subtle conversations, and they can also be difficult. And this plays back to conversations around inclusion overall. Conversations about diversity, about inclusion, they're not always easy ones to have. They can be difficult, they can be uncomfortable. And I always encourage individuals to get comfortable with a little bit of that discomfort. So the second factor in removing barriers and paving the way towards awareness of inequity is women mentors. So 65% of men who were mentored by women were more aware of gender bias in our study and expressed a higher awareness of gender inequity than those who weren't. So this having women mentors actually played a key role in the perspectives and the views of those men that they were mentoring. The third factor, and this is an important one, is a sense of fair play. And this really plays out as a sensitivity and commitment to issues of fairness and equity. We found that having this, if you want to almost call it a sixth sense, this sense of fair play, it actually predicts awareness of gender inequality. The stronger this sixth sense, the more likely men are to be aware. And interestingly, on the flip side, with men who express low awareness of gender inequity, we saw that the majority, over 60% actually, had exclusively been mentored by men. So out of these three different factors for removing barriers to participating in gender equality conversations, it's the third one, that sense of fair play, that was actually found to be the key predictor of championship behavior for men. So we really want to capitalize on this sense of fair play. The myths include, for example, that men only care about the business case of diversity and inclusion. Men are champions because of concern, maybe for individuals, but only for women that they actually care about that are in their lives. So, for example, their partners, their spouses, their children. Another myth is that sexist attitudes keep men from engaging as partners or champions of inclusion. But on the flip side, the facts are actually that visible champions are indeed driven by their personal values. So this is very much a personal values-based conversation. Concern for women isn't enough. Male champions participate because they also derive personal benefit. And so we want to see a link between the change and the benefit to both men and women. And many men support equality but are held back, not because they don't want to be a part of the conversation, but perhaps out of fear or a combination of fear and inexperience. So I'll tell you a little bit about some work that Catalyst has done with a company called Rockwell Automation. So how can we enhance an individual's sense of fair play? We've seen that that's really a key factor here in this work around engaging men. Well, one of our global supporters, Rockwell Automation, took a unique approach and a direct approach to creating opportunities for the development of awareness of gender equity internally in their organization. Beginning back in 2011, the North American sales division of Rockwell asked a large group of their people managers, who were mostly white men, to participate in one of two extensive learning labs. The objective of these learning labs and this initiative overall was to equip white men to play a central role and not solely to rely on women and non-white colleagues to lead the conversation around diversity. And so in order to help white men recognize themselves as a group with cultural norms and privilege that disadvantage women and other groups, this was another aspect of these learning labs that were taking place. The program has since been expanded to include thousands of men and women throughout the organization, and it's been met with great success over the years. Catalyst has looked at the perceptions of participants before and after the learning labs. And over the course of just a few months, for example, earlier on in the study, we found evidence that the program did in fact have a transformative effect, helping to shift both mindsets and behaviors of participants. And participants not only became significantly more accepting of the notion of white male privilege, but also showed improvement on 5 critical behaviors for building relationships across difference. And we found those 5 critical factors to be, first of all, critical thinking. So questioning one's own assumptions. Secondly, taking responsibility for being inclusive rather than focusing on what others should do. Third, inquiring across differences, actively seeking out diverse perspectives. We do a lot of work at Catalyst around inclusive communication and how you can be a better communicator from an inclusion perspective. And one of those key factors in being a more inclusive communicator is to inquire across difference. Find others that are unlike yourself and talk to them, and really talk to them. And then this leads us to number 4, which is really listening. Really listening and taking others' perspectives without trying to convince them that your views are right. And also without, if you want to call it, inserting your story into theirs. So when you're listening, take that break and actually listen to what the other person has to say. Hear their perspective. Let them sense that they are being heard, and avoid jumping in with your own story, which may be what you think is a similar view, but may in fact be your own unique viewpoint. And finally, be willing to have difficult conversations about points of difference. As I mentioned earlier, conversations that involve diversity and inclusion can be difficult. They can be tough to engage in, but they can have great benefit, and we can really all benefit as individuals, men, women, organizations, when we sit down and talk about our points of difference rather than avoiding them or ignoring them or pretending that there's not a problem or even hoping that they'll go away. So specifically in this work with Rockwell Automation, we found that employees within the North American sales division were noticing a decrease in incivility as ratings of the frequency of negative gossip decreased by almost 40%. And I find this idea about negative gossip to be interesting. This is important because research shows that women and non-white individuals are more likely to experience incivility, including gossip, and this contributes to the feelings of exclusion and being on the outside that many individuals from these groups report. So this speaks to actually our Catalyst research on the topic of otherness. And we found actually that when people have the experience of feeling like an other, where they are different from those around them, where they feel like they are not belonging and they're not part of the standard normative group, a number of things start to happen. And we see these various factors playing out whereby individuals tend to be promoted less. They tend to be at lower ranks in the organization than their experience and background would dictate. They tend to have less exposure to senior executive mentors and role models. They have less access to high-profile assignments, as well as highly visible international assignments. And ultimately, not surprisingly, they start to downsize their aspirations. And this is where this conversation really becomes important in terms of not just being a conversation about diversity and inclusion, but it's a conversation about talent. And if we have individuals that are experiencing this sense of otherness and who are downsizing their aspirations, we are ultimately leaving talent on the table as organizations, and we are not gaining the benefit, the best potential of our talent. So it's really important that we address this. So this idea of individuals experiencing less incivility in the workplace as a result of these conversation and learning labs was actually quite beneficial. And we also found a significant shift in participants' views about the existence of white male privilege. So before the labs, participants were pretty non-committal about whether they agreed that white men received advantages from belonging to the group that holds the majority of power in business. But after the labs, there was a 17% change in agreement. And on average, participants agreed that white men do, in fact, have some advantages or experience some privilege that comes from a group's status in society. And so one of the things that we found here as a result of these learning labs as well was that it's so critical to have allies in the workplace. If we are going to create change with respect to gender equality and to advancing women in the workplace, it's necessary to engage allies, and those allies, by definition, would be senior level men. So in terms of unlocking the participation of those senior male allies, a few of the things that we want to think about are, we want to discourage some of that zero-sum thinking. So we want to discourage the viewpoint that, if women are being given opportunities to advance, that men are going to lose out. We also want to focus on personal relevance. Find champions who actually believe in this mission and who believe in this work for not only professional, but also personal reasons, who have a vested interest in the conversation. That being said, invite men into the conversation. Men can't be allies if they are not actually included and invited into that dialogue. Expose men to male role models. So if there are senior male leaders who are doing a terrific job of being part of this conversation, of championing gender equality, bring other men to that conversation. And even when you have, for example, individuals who may be a bit skeptical about this conversation, this is an opportunity to expose them to male role models who are championing the work and who do believe in the value of it from a business imperative perspective, as well as a personal one. Provide women mentors for men. As I mentioned earlier in the research report, that was one of the benefits for removing some of the barriers with respect to men being engaged in the dialogue, providing women mentors. So younger emerging leader men, it's a terrific opportunity for senior women to actually mentor them, to bring them into the fold, into the conversation, and into the dialogue. Remaining curious and open to learning, that's obviously a sort of a given within the workplace environment and advancing in the workplace. And lastly, adopting an inclusive leadership mindset, re-examining leadership traits. So within Catalyst, we've done a ton of research around the topic of inclusion and inclusive leadership. And one of the things that we have found is that when individuals experience inclusion, I mentioned several of the benefits that play out for organizations, but we actually went back to see what are some of the key behaviors that leaders are demonstrating in order to create this environment where people feel included. And we found 4 key behaviors for inclusive leaders. They included empowerment, accountability, courage, and humility. And so we also referred to those as the EACH mindset, so that acronym EACH. And we found that when leaders were demonstrating these behaviors of empowerment, accountability, courage, and humility, that they were apt to create this more inclusive environment where people experienced a sense of inclusion. So this brings me to, I'd like to share a bit about our Marc program with you. The Marc program, and Marc stands for, it's M-A-R-C, it stands for Men Advocating Real Change. And you can also learn more about this program and initiative at our site, which is On the Marc. That's on the marc.org, along with the catalyst.org website. So these two sites can share a lot of information around these initiatives with you, as well as a broad range of our research. So with respect to Marc, it's a large community that brings together senior male leaders for conversation and dialogue with respect to inclusion. Marc really examines the barriers and factors that both limit and drive men's participation in the conversation. So some of the conversation we've just been having now, as well as discussing common business framing of equality and gender and how this impacts the partnership. There's an exploration of gender stereotypes and the mutual benefit of equality. So there's a great benefit for all individuals when we see greater equality within organizations. And specifically, we have the opportunity to lead individuals through conversation and skills-based role-playing type of conversation and dialogue around understanding unconscious bias, privilege, inclusive leadership, and what kind of opportunities exist for leaders to play a critical role in efforts to lead change. So that's a little bit about Marc. We have a specific program called Marc Leaders, and these are workshops of varying ranges that actually provide a value add for organizations in terms of providing some structure and direction around this work on how to engage men in the dialogue. Utilizing accelerators and motivators for men, and establishing this actual network of like-minded colleagues, because it's tough. It's one thing to have this conversation in a solo environment or externally, but it's another to bring it back to your organization with a group of your colleagues who are all at senior levels and who are influencers in the organization and have the ability to extend that conversation with a ripple effect throughout the organization. some of the commitments that leaders have made when they've come out of these Marc conversations, just to give you an idea of some very practical things that individuals have implemented, include, for example, evaluating salary bands for inequalities, joining ERG leadership teams. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with ERGs, those would be employee resource groups or affinity groups or networks within the organization. Developing elevator pitches for engaging other men. So we mentioned, I mentioned the idea of having other male role models in terms of this work. If you're a senior level man and you want to be engaging in this conversation, encouraging others to do the same, what's your quick elevator pitch that you can share with others as to why this is important, why it matters? Other commitments that alumni have made through coming out of this Marc work include sponsoring a woman. So I mentioned the opportunity to sponsor others who are unlike you. There's huge value in that. Also, further investigating personal blind spots. So it's really important for all of us to consider, what are some of our unconscious biases? What do those look like? Where do we, each and every one of us, experience privilege? So every single one of us experiences privilege in some way, shape, or form. And each and every one of us actually lack that privilege in some way as well. So let's explore some of those biases as well as the privilege that we hold and understand better what some of our personal blind spots may be. Other commitments that have been made include partnering with other senior leaders in evaluating succession plans. So really dig deep into the organization to see where are potential biases. How can conversations be held that engage senior male leaders in order to make change in some of these critical systems and processes within our organization, such as succession planning? Debrief some of these Marc leader conversations with other work teams, and partner with women to build safe spaces to discuss opportunities. So these are just some of the commitments that we've seen coming out of the Marc Leaders Program and what various leaders have committed to doing. In terms of steps that individuals can take, I've included here a number of sort of quick lists of tips, and happy to share some of these as takeaways for individuals as well. So don't feel any need to, write down anything frantically. We can always share these after the fact. In terms of actions that men can take to create more inclusive workplaces, number one, be open. Be open with other men about your commitment to creating a workplace that's gender inclusive and invite them to join you. Second, talk to other men about the cost of gender inequity, both for men and women in the workplace. So what are some of the downsides of not having equality or equity within the workplace? We've heard about many of the benefits. Use work-life flexibility benefits if you have them. This is a big one. So we often see individuals will be sort of slipping out of the workplace, or they may not be talking about benefits that they're utilizing, but this is a great opportunity for men to step up. So for example, taking advantage of paternity leaves or family leaves and telecommuting, and to manage your work and personal responsibilities and not being shy about actually communicating that. So rather than just saying, I've got a commitment on Tuesday and Thursdays at 4 o'clock, it's okay to actually share that you've got X commitment with your children, and these are the days that you're unavailable, or these are the times that you're unavailable. It provides role modeling at the senior male level, and it also provides a perception for emerging leaders and direct reports that this is okay, and that having life both inside and outside the workplace is okay. Next, communicate your support for male colleagues who use work-life flexibility policies and benefits that are managing their own work and their own personal responsibilities. Take responsibility for your own learning. This is a really big one. Don't rely on women colleagues to learn about gender inequality. Use your own observations and fact-finding skills, and seek out resources to educate yourself. This is, I really do emphasize this, because oftentimes what happens is that individuals that belong to, if you want to call it a diverse group, they are almost made to feel put on the spot that they need to educate others on what it's like to be them in the organization. And while that is part of the conversation, it's actually a multidimensional conversation where it's on the part of individuals that are, if you want to call it, diverse, but it's also on those individuals that are part of the majority group to actually focus on their own learning as well. And mentor and sponsor an emerging woman leader. Encourage your male peers to do the same. So I mentioned the value of mentoring, sponsoring individuals who are unlike you. Also, be attentive to whether men and women colleagues are being judged by different standards. So, for example, when promotion criteria are based on potential for men and more on demonstrated achievement for women, you want to highlight these things, call them out. If marital or parental status is being considered in personnel decisions concerning women, but not for men. So for example, if you've got male and female candidates for a role and you're stopping to say, maybe with completely positive intent, stopping to say, well, we don't want to provide this opportunity to so-and-so because she's got young children and she most likely doesn't want to travel. I urge you not to make those decisions for others, but to actually present the opportunities and let individuals make those decisions for themselves. So let's avoid inserting our own unconscious biases or stereotypes. So speak up if you observe gender bias at work as well. And also share your stories of working for inclusion with other men, both the good and the bad. You know, it's important for us to learn both from our failures as well as our successes so that everyone can learn from the experience. So if there's been a time and place where you've been particularly inclusive, or to be honest, if there's a time when maybe you've slipped up and had, a misstep, talk about those examples. Going back to those inclusive leadership behaviors that I mentioned earlier, that were empowerment, accountability, courage, and humility. A great part of humility is actually being able to admit to your own mistakes or your own missteps, and then talk about not only the mistake, but how you then went on to course correct. This can provide a really great opportunity for learning for ourselves, but also for direct reports to be able to see, okay, these things happen. Mistakes do happen. They see you as a leader who's more human, who's more inclusive, and they see that it's possible to recover from these mistakes and to course correct and to move on from them and to succeed ultimately. And lastly, in terms of the actions that men can take, get involved in your organization's gender-focused employee resource groups or women's networks, for example, or start one if your organization doesn't have any. This is a great opportunity to be seen and perceived as an ally as well. Now, we've talked a lot about what men can do, but it's very important to think about the fact that this conversation around diversity and inclusion, it's something that involves everyone. So for women, there are many steps that women can take here as well. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them, but I will call out a few of them here. First of all, be the change that you want to see. Make sure that you're role modeling the inclusive leadership that you want to see from men. And don't forget that working with men on these issues creates learning opportunities for you as well. So this isn't just a matter of, men need to do all of these things differently. These are conversations that we all as individuals need to have together and be a part of. I'll also call out the example of recognize that men also experience bias and have aspects of their identity beyond maleness. So just like women, men experience societal expectations around gender and what it means to be a man, which may be challenging. I mentioned that idea of the man box previously, which may include, expectations that society have of not expressing emotions, boys don't cry, always needing to be strong, and various things like that. So there are stereotypes that men can experience as well. And so we all want to be able to check our own biases and stop and evaluate whether or not our blind spots are at play and whether we can get past those or interrupt those biases. be prepared for men to make mistakes and for all of us to make mistakes. This is part of the learning process, and we want to think about how to course correct after that. And if you know men who value equity and inclusion, hold them accountable to living those values. Challenge them to be more involved. They might not be involved for some of the reasons that we mentioned earlier in terms of barriers to inclusion or barriers to participation. So encourage that participation in a positive and inclusive way. And I think an important one as well is when you witness well-intentioned men who are reproducing inequalities or in some way unintentionally abusing male privilege, call them out, but always in a non-accusatory manner. This is not an us versus them conversation. This is a conversation where we're trying to bring individuals together as a group to create a more inclusive work environment. And lastly, I'll mention, listen to the experience of visible minority men. Men of color or visible minority men can be very strong allies in creating inclusion, which can't exist without engaging people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. So that goes without saying, but I think that it bears repeating as something to watch out for. And lastly, I think it's really important to call out, we've talked about the experiences of individuals. We've talked about how this can benefit men and how women can benefit from the conversation around gender equality. But there's steps for organizations as a whole to take. So if there's anyone that's on the call today that's, for example, part of a diversity and inclusion group, or leading a women's network, or leading a male champions network in your organization, there's some great steps here that you may want to take back either to your network, to your D&I team, to your HR, business partners and leaders, and more. So first off, implementing a diversity and inclusion campaign. Specifically target men as part of the solution. Again, not an us versus them conversation, but how can we get together, engaging men as champions, as allies, to be part of the solution in terms of women's advancement within the organization to create that greater diversity at senior levels. Ensure that the business case for change includes mutual wins and benefits for all employees. Explore and communicate what everyone, men included, gains in environments that are inclusive. So we all benefit, as I mentioned previously. Invite men to educational opportunities that increase their awareness of gender bias. So, if there's some learnings that you've taken out of this conversation, share those with your colleagues as well. And recognize that men have aspects of their identity that are beyond maleness. That's what I just mentioned in our previous list as well. Ensure that men are visibly recognized for solution building in your organization so that they also have role models to follow. So if there are individuals in your company that are doing a great job at this already, make sure that they're recognized and that others are able to see them as role models. I'm going to come down the list towards the very end where I want to highlight creating systems to ensure administrative tasks such as scheduling meetings or taking minutes are rotated among men and women rather than allowing them to be routinely delegated to women. Now, I mention this with a bit of a smirk because it's something that we often see taking place in organizations. And this is where unconscious biases and stereotypes come in. There is typically no malintent where this happens in organizations, but it often does. And these are the small, subtle nuances and things that and behaviors that can actually be called out. They don't need to be called out in a negative or aggressive manner, but they can be called out in informal conversations. You could have, for example, in meetings, bias busters who will hold up a sign when they see that there's some kind of bias or stereotype taking place. If the stereotype is that the woman in the room is going to take notes at the end of the meeting or take minutes throughout the meeting, let's bust that bias and let's get past that and turn that into something that we rotate amongst all participants. And lastly, from an organizational perspective, I think this one is important to call out. Provide paternity leave and encourage men to use it. Make sure that male senior leaders in the organizations are taking this so that both men and women are encouraged to follow suit.